Today's critique examines a submitted script that analyzes Donald Trump's recent social media denunciation of right-wing podcasters over their stances on Iran and Israel, eventually framing his actions through the theological archetype of the biblical figure Esau. Let's dive right into the feedback to help strengthen this piece.
I am really excited to jump into this one. The ambition here is just off the charts.
Oh, completely. Which brings us to our first major point. The theological comparison of Donald Trump to the biblical figure of Esau provides a strikingly original lens for political analysis, yet it is currently buried in the final act of the material.
Yeah, buried is the right word. I mean, it's a massive weakness right out of the gate.
Right. As I understand it from the notes, the author is using Rabbi Ryden Kessin's theory to completely reframe the former president.
Right. The whole idea that he embodies Esau.
Exactly. That he's this earthy, impulsive, very unrefined figure. But he channels that chaotic energy to protect Jacob, representing the Jewish people, and to fight against evil despots.
It is such a unique way to view modern geopolitics. I mean, I read a mountain of political analysis every week, and this actually stopped me in my track.
But here's the weakness, right? The audience is forced to wade through a tremendous amount of standard, incredibly familiar political commentary in the first half before ever reaching this compelling hook.
Yes. Oh my goodness, yes. It's just a slog at the start.
You open the piece, and you get these long, familiar recaps of social media posts, like detailing the specific insults about Megyn Kelly over that really old Rosie O'Donnell question.
Or recounting Alex Jones and his bankruptcy issues. Like, we all know this stuff already.
Right. And by doing this, the material risks losing the listener's attention entirely before delivering its most profound insight.
I actually found myself starting to skim those first few pages.
Me too. And I think we have to talk about the psychology of the reader here. Anyone who is clicking on an analysis piece about right-wing podcasters and Donald Trump, they are already deeply saturated in the daily news cycle.
Exactly. They practically live on Twitter or X or whatever.
They already know the true social posts. They live through all the endless news cycles regarding the name-calling and the base fracturing.
So their brains immediately categorize those opening paragraphs as known information. And the second a reader thinks, I already know this story, their engagement just drops to zero.
They assume the rest of the piece is just going to be a standard, predictable recap of a political spat.
Right, and they will totally tune out before they get to the actual intellectual meat of the essay. You're asking a fatigued reader to endure more fatigue.
So my suggestion for improvement here is to radically restructure the narrative, to front-load the Esau and Jacob framework, establishing it immediately as the guiding lens for the entire critique.
I love that. You really have to introduce this rugged, aggressive theological archetype right at the very top of page 1.
Like, don't wait. But some might argue you need to set the stage first, right? Explain what happened on social media before you analyze it.
I'd push back on that. The stage is already set by reality. You don't need to summarize the news for this specific target audience. You just need to cast a completely new light on it.
Okay, so let's give some concrete examples of how to actually do this in the text.
Sure. So as one potential way to fix this, instead of starting with a chronological recap of all those social media posts, the author should write an opening paragraph that introduces the Esau archetype right away.
Right. Describe the historical dynamic between Esau and Jacob first.
Exactly. Then you use the former president's specific attacks on those podcasters as real-time, modern evidence of this ancient dynamic playing out.
Oh, that makes so much sense, because the script highlights his sloppy and impulsive language, like when he attacks Tucker Carlson as a broken man.
Right, and if you front-loaded the archetype, you don't just present that quote as a random petty insult.
You explicitly frame it from the very first paragraph as the raw energy of Esau being deployed to stand up for moral clarity regarding Iran.
Yes, that completely changes the biological reaction of the reader. You are taking a mundane political squabble and elevating it to a clash of biblical proportions from sentence 1.
It transforms the reading experience entirely. They aren't reviewing a feud anymore. They're watching history manifest in real time.
Which is exactly the jolt of originality you need to keep a jaded political junkie glued to the page.
Absolutely. But introducing that rugged, aggressive archetype early on, naturally brings us to our second point. The material creates an unintended tonal friction by defending the protagonist's personal insults while simultaneously expressing distaste for the ad hominem rhetoric of the antagonists.
Oh man, this was a major stumbling block for me. The tonal friction is very real.
Right, because he makes the right moral choices on the world stage.
Exact. But then, literally moments later, the author claims to not be, quote, personally into all the ad hom stuff, unquote, when they reference internet jokes about Alex Jones binging on Dunkin' Donuts.
The weakness here is that a skeptical listener will instantly perceive a massive double standard, and that just shatters the author's credibility.
Yeah, if messy language and personal insults are acceptable for the leader because of his policy stances, complaining about the podcaster's tone undermines the author's own philosophical framework. It really does. It weakens the overall argument because it makes the analysis seem selectively outraged. Like, my guys are allowed to be mean, but your guys have to be polite.
Right, but I have to play devil's advocate for a second. Isn't calling out hypocrisy kind of the fun of political writing? I mean, the Dunkin' Donuts line about Alex Jones is pretty funny.
It is funny, sure.
So if we remove the author's personal distaste for the podcaster's behavior, do we risk flattening the essay and losing that unique voice?
I don't think you lose the voice, but you do gain internal consistency. And when an author is internally consistent, the reader trusts their logic implicitly.
That makes sense. The cognitive dissonance of the double standard just pulls the reader out of the argument entirely.
Exactly. So my suggestion for improvement is to shift the criticism of the podcasters entirely away from their tone or personal flaws and focus the contrast strictly on their detachment from objective reality and traditional conservative values.
Oh, okay. So you beat them on the battlefield of facts, not on politeness.
Spot on. If the defense of the protagonist is words don't matter, only actions matter, then the critique of the antagonists must be your actions and your grasp of reality are fundamentally broken.
Let's give some concrete examples of how to execute that shift. Looking at the text, the author actually has all the evidence they need regarding Candace Owens.
Oh yeah, the Iran situation.
Right. So as an example, lean heavily into the factual contrasts. The script mentions her conspiratorial dismissal of a high-risk U.S. mission to rescue a downed F-15 pilot in Iran.
She brushed it off as a mere Top Gun narrative.
Right. And she did this despite actual verified footage of helicopters taking fire.
So instead of complaining about her snarky tone, you contrast this severe detachment from reality with the former president's tangible, real-world policy act.
You attack her lack of factual grounding. You highlight the absurdity of treating a literal military rescue mission like a movie script.
And you can do the exact same thing with Tucker Carlson as another example.
How so?
Well, the script currently criticizes his awkward frowning and his dismissive attitude. You can just cut all of that tone policing. Attack him entirely for his ideological shift instead.
Oh, like using the provided example where he praises non-authoritarian socialism as a Christian ideal?
Yes, exactly. You frame the antagonist's flaw purely as a failure of truth and policy, not a failure of politeness.
That creates such a bulletproof thematic stance. The argument essentially becomes, we are the side of reality and action. They are the side of fiction and performance.
And think about how perfectly that mirrors the defense of the Esau archetype.
Oh, wow, yes. Because Esau isn't polite. Esau is rough and violent, but he operates in the real world to achieve a tangible good.
Precisely. Grounding the critique of the podcasters in objective reality perfectly sets the stage for the essay's massive finale.
Which we desperately need to set up properly, because the script takes a massive conceptual leap later on. This brings us to our third critique. The sudden shift from secular political commentary into a discussion about satanic forces and spiritual warfare feels abrupt and risks alienating a segment of the audience without a proper thematic bridge.
I have to admit, I got completely stuck on this transition. Did it give you whiplash too?
It absolutely did. It was jarring. The script moves from these very secular grievances, like discussing the horseshoe theory where the far right and far left converge in their anti-Zionism, straight into the assertion that Satan and negative powers are testing the world before the Messianic era.
Yeah, the weakness there is that jumping directly from a critique of podcasting business models and grievance politics straight into cosmic spiritual testing lacks a transitional mechanism.
It literally asks the reader to switch from a geopolitical mindset
to an apocalyptic, mystical one in a single sentence.
And a secular reader's brain is just going to completely reject that premise.
Because if I'm a political junkie, my analytical tools are, polls, tax policies, voting trends. If you tell me the driving force behind a podcast feud is demonic intervention, I'm going to assume you've lost the plot.
Exactly. It's like shifting gears in a manual car. You're in first gear, cruising through secular politics, and you try to jam the transmission straight into sixth gear for cosmic spiritual testing.
The engine stalls.
Right. You have to use the clutch. You need a transition.
So what is the suggestion to fix this structural flow?
The suggestion is to use the concept of total ideological collapse as the logical stepping stone bridge between the secular political analysis and the deeper spiritual argument.
Okay, I really like that approach. You have to actively prove to the reader that secular logic has failed before you can successfully introduce spiritual logic.
Yes, you walk them to the edge of the cliff and show them that their compass is spinning wildly.
Let's talk about a concrete way to build that bridge in the text. As an example, after discussing the horseshoe theory and that bizarre convergence of right-wing podcasters echoing far-left anti-American talking points, the author should argue that traditional political compasses have completely broken down.
Show that standard political science just cannot explain what we are seeing anymore.
Right. Tax policy and border security simply can't explain why these totally diverse groups are uniting in this highly specific hatred.
And once you dismantle their reliance on secular politics, the reader feels a void. They need an explanation for the chaos.
And that is the exact moment you introduce the spiritual explanation. And the author already has the perfect tool for this buried in the text, right? The analogy of Cain and Abel.
Yes, that analogy is brilliant, but it needs to be positioned correctly as the bridge. As a concrete way to implement this, frame the podcaster's anti-Semitism not just as bad foreign policy, but as the same primal jealousy and darkness seen in Cain's resentment of Abel's unique blessing.
Oh, that's incredibly strong. You're using the Cain and Abel story to explain the psychological root of the horseshoe theory.
Isn't because of a shared economic policy. It's because they are tapping into a primal, ancient jealousy that predates modern politics.
And by establishing that secular politics can no longer explain the hatred, you create a natural, compelling necessity to look for a spiritual explanation.
Exactly, which smoothly guides the listener into the discussion of the Messianic era and the final testing of humanity. It no longer feels like a sudden, unhinged tangent.
It feels like an inevitable, logical conclusion. You've held their hand across the bridge, rather than just shoving them into the spiritual realm and hoping for the best.
It really comes down to respecting the reader's journey. You're taking them from their daily Twitter feed all the way back to the book of Genesis. You have to lay the tracks for that train to travel on.
And the breakdown of secular ideology is the perfect track. When you piece all of these structural changes together, the essay transforms from a slightly confusing political rant into a deeply profound piece of theological commentary.
It really does. The core material is so strong, it just needs to be organized to maximize its impact.
All right, let's briefly recap the actionable steps for the listener. First, front-load the deeply original Esau archetype to hook the audience immediately, establishing the theological lens in the opening paragraph.
Second, resolve the tonal friction by focusing the critique of the podcasters purely on objective truth and ideological consistency, rather than their ad hominem attacks or personal flaws.
And finally, build a smoother thematic bridge between the secular political horseshoe theory and the spiritual Cain and Abel dynamic, using the concept of total ideological collapse.
We warmly invite the creator to revise the material using these high-level insights and to submit it back to the show for another critique. We would absolutely love to see how this piece evolves once the structure is tightened up.
Absolutely. It all comes back to how we analyze the world around us. When you unearth a geopolitical landscape operating on a cosmic scale, you can't just slap a standard political label on it. To do justice to reality, you have to be willing to rewrite the rules of analysis. Thanks for joining us for this critique.